Now that we have a baseline for the history of the vampires as a whole, as well as the Lamian vampires, we can start to work into some of the other bloodlines to really flesh out the tumultuous history of the vampires as a whole. Man, that was not even a really good pun, was it? Now, remember, you're dealing with 7 master vampires that make up the fabric or bloodlines that each vampire adheres to in one way or another. From the mastery of the necromancy that the Necrarch employ to the bestial ferocity of the Strigoi, which is actually the subject of our next bloodline, the Strigoi, or the vampires of the Strygos Empire. We very quickly talked about him during our Lamian video, but Neferata had a brother, Prince Ushoran, the Lord of Masks. I think I actually called him the Mask of Masks in my video. But the Lord of Masks. Neferata was doling out that the elixir of life that we talked about to those that she deemed worthy of joining her elite caste, but she intentionally kept her brother out of the kind of proverbial party. Because, nothing says vampire party like drinking a cup of someone else's blood and flaunting that in front of them. Like, haha, I drank the blood, I drank the blood. But Ushoran, ever the clever man, decides to steal the elixir and thus grants himself vampirism. In the early portions of the lore, and I want to say like around 6th edition or so, Ushoran was the spy master of Neferata, which would explain his underhandedness. And unfortunately, in the later lore, especially after in the latter lore, I guess you could say, especially during the release of the Warhammer Legends Neferata book, this was actually retconned. Ushoran is really more of a Lord of Revels than he is of anything of particularly crafty or spy mastery kind of sense. And this quite obviously thoroughly pisses Neferata off, right? Him stealing the elixir of life. But she had already made a rule within Lamia that no vampire could hurt or attack another of their kind unless it was a duel, and also not to the death. The duels can never be to the death. And keep that in mind. This is a pact that remains even outside of the extent of Lamia as a city. It extends beyond that. So keep that in mind, and it's going to come around again later, I promise. So Neferata just kind of broods and plots here, something we've discussed she's particularly good at. And Ushoran lived in relative peace throughout the Lamian period of vampirism as a member of the Deathless Court, as it's called. He preyed upon whoever, criminal or otherwise. Abhorrash had kind of, Abhorrash, the leader of the Blood Dragons, had said, hey, only prey on criminals or else we're going to get figured out. And everyone said, Abhorrash, you worry too much. We know how that went. So when Alcatazor besieged the city, Ushoran, who had warned Neferata this would happen, fled from Lamia almost immediately. And Ushoran and Abhorrash were 2 of the only vampires to really completely flee from Lamia and seemingly not fall under the rule of Nagash, despite the lore dictating that Nagash gained control of the entire vampire race. To kind of give you guys a bit of a backstory on this, and I was going to save it for Vashanish, but I think it's important to go into now. After Lamia fell, Wasworan led the renegade vampires to Nagash. They thought they were fleeing, but he led them right to Nagash, who granted Vashanish, the husband of Neferata, a ring that would allow him to truly live forever. By slipping the ring on, though, it actually gave Nagash control over every member of the vampire race. And after Nagash's defeat, this control was broken, and Vashanish is who Vlad von Karstein once was, and who and Vlad von Karstein is who Vashanish eventually becomes. And the ring is actually the earliest version of the von Karstein family ring. It kind of talks about how he spends the majority of his undeath life trying to find a way to break the bonds of this ring that the Nagash has given them. We'll get to that later. So either this is just a discrepancy in the lore, or their role during the return of Nagash was so minor that it wasn't worth mentioning. I honestly don't know. It's not really fleshed out. So after the fall of Nagash, 5 of the vampire bloodlines move north into the old world, and the other 2, the lost bloodlines, vanish into Cathay and the northern Chaos Wastes. Kind of in that never to be heard from again type scenario, but they go their own way. So regardless of the events of the Rise of Nagash, enter the next episode, A New Hope, the Strygos edition. So while Ushoran traveled north through the Badlands, he came across the burgeoning Strygos Empire in its capital city of Mourkain. And this can be seen on some ancient empire maps as the city of Mourkheim, but it was a particularly strong up-and-coming power in the land ruled over by a gentleman named Cadon. And usually, in other circumstances, a vampire has to go about the business of converting the populace to the, I guess you could say, notion of necromancy and dead. But with Mourkain, the work was really kind of already done for Ushoran. Cadon ruled as a priest king that worshipped Nagash as a god. And Ushoran went about the business of replacing Cadon, who was a tyrant to his people, then placing vampires as the patron above Nagash. It's kind of a really interesting situation that happens, but Cadon was eventually killed by the same implement that was the fuel for his necromantic power, the crown of sorcery, or, as it is known, the crown of Nagash. Alcatazar, after killing Nagash and fleeing from Nehekhara, gave the crown to Cadon during his exodus into the kind of open world and doomed to really live forever. And we'll talk about why he's doomed to live forever when we talk about Neferata's full blown out lore. But really what happens here is you get this complete shift of power where Cadon gets replaced by Ushoran. Nagash gets replaced by vampirism as far as like a worship of it. And that becomes a repeating motif for the Strigoi vampires themselves. They have this weird sense of or desire for adulation, to be worshipped as these kind of gods. And that kind of comes around full circle as they're in their very twisted and broken end form. But the crown eventually killed Cadon, and Ushoran took the mantle of King of Mourkain, and thus the Strygos Empire. And under Ushoran, the empire, it grew. It became Lamia reborn and a haven for the creatures of the night. And imparting a rule set out by the blood dragon Abhorash, all vampires could only feed on criminals. And thus, Strygos knew a time of great prosperity and peace without any crime to really kind of plague the growing empire. And Ushoran then kind of summoned the other 4 bloodlines to Strygos, he hoping to strengthen the empire and claiming that he had created a haven that was far grander and stronger than Lamia. Even the constant grudge bearer, this infuriated Neferata yet again, who started to finally enact her plot of revenge, or I guess you could say Neferata strikes back, if I'm keeping my Star Wars motifs going. God, I'm stupid. But let's look at this for a second. Lamia was a singular city in a grander empire that was rather limited in its ability to grow due to the necessity for clandestine movement. I mean, come on, think of it. Lamia was a portion of Nehekhara. Not like that here. You really couldn't do much of anything. You couldn't really proclaim yourself a vampire, as it was shunned. Hell, Neferata killed her own cousin Khalida because she suspected that Khalida had figured it out, that she was a vampire. So Mourkain, on the other hand, had no such limitations and actually worshipped the vampires as gods in direct links to Nagash. So you kind of have this really crazy situation where Lamia, a city within an empire, versus Mourkain, the capital of an empire. So it's a very interesting kind of split between these two. But Ushoran, the prince that had been cast down by Neferata, had risen far above anything she had even ever created. And the real question we have to ask is, was this revenge or a power move against someone who had clearly and obviously superseded her, an enemy, really, as it were, and someone that she had kind of said, this person's not going to amount to anything, and here they are, creating the empire that she was destined to have created. But back on track. Neferata spreads lies that Ushoran is actually planning to imprison and hand over the other True Blood vampires to the newly risen Nagash. And this does not bode well, as the vampires are still kind of reeling from their last enslavement some 200 years prior, and this started a secret war against the Strygos Empire. Vampire assassins and barbarian armies were sent against Ushoran to try and destroy what he had created. This really kind of starts the Fall of Mourkain. And during one such kind of incursion, and these incursions of large barbarian invasions, Ushoran was caught out of the city when a massive orc Wa swept through the land. In the earlier lore, it was led by Dork Red-Eye, an orc war boss, but in the later and more recent lore, like 7th, 8th edition, we have an unnamed orc shaman. It's kind of a little less ceremonious, in my opinion. But eventually, Mourkain itself was beset by the Green Tide, the prince hurriedly kind of making his way back to the capital to defend it. And there, the Strygos Empire, which is actually, the members of the Strygos Empire are called the Strigani, Strigany, fought day and night against the Greenskins. And in a last battle, just as the people of Strygos were to win the day, Ushoran was destroyed by a huge magic blast from the shaman, killing them both in the process. So Mourkain starts to slowly fall into ruin, because now you have the Strigoi vampires without their true bloodlord, Ushoran, there to act as a staple, as a monarch, basically. And what happens is each one of the individual bloodlines kind of takes part in hunting down the Strigoi vampires. Mourkain itself starts to fall into ruin. The Strygos Empire gets pulled apart by all these barbarian and orc invasions. And eventually you've got this whole cast of vampires that were all basically direct descendants of Ushoran fleeing for their dear lives. I mean, every time they come across Lamians, they were dead, or they would try to go and hide with them and they would be killed. And the Blood Dragon vampires would hunt them for sport. The Necrarch vampires would kind of take them in and use them for all means of kind of like dirty necromantic experiments. So essentially you kind of have this extreme falling out where these vampires are so scared of their own race, and they're so scared of humans who are now hunting against them as well, that they've gone completely into hiding, to the point where they start to eat and dine upon the recently deceased, kind of sticking to the graveyards and the kind of destitute areas of the world that are a little bit more secluded, more kind of removed from society. And as a result, you get these bestial kind of true form vampires, these vampires they kind of reflect the inner beast inside of all vampires. In the 6th edition lore, and I bring this up so much because the 6th edition is the last time we saw the vampire bloodlines as a separate force entity with its own bloodline abilities and so on and so forth in the Warhammer Fantasy world. After that, they kind of got shoved out, and immediately they were just kind of pushed into, everyone's a von Karstein vampire. But in that earlier lore, they kind of stuck mainly to mausoleums, and they became had these massive court of ghouls. And in 6th edition, that was it. You had the Strigoi Ghoul King, and then you had ghouls as really the only real form of anything ghoulish. It wasn't until the 7th edition that you got the additions of the crypt ghouls, which you guys know and love, but then you have the Varghulfs, then you have crypt horrors coming in 8th edition, Terrorgeists coming in 8th edition, or these things that didn't exist before. I mean, even the Strigoi Ghoul King himself really only had one member of his court, just the Ghoul, when it first came about. But now the Strigoi Ghoul King kind of applies to those crypt horrors, to those Varghulfs, to those Terrorgeists, to those abyssal terrors, all the kind of terrible things that are a lot more of a perversion of necromancy versus the kind of focused use that you see with graveguard skeletons and zombies. It's definitely more of a bestial approach to things. And that's kind of the crux of Strigoi as a whole, that they are by no means reduced in their magical abilities. They still have magical abilities, but it's a little bit more subtle, and a little bit more indicative of their bestial traits. And we see that directly represented in the Strigoi bloodline kind of special abilities and traits. If you chose your vampire to become a Strigoi in the 6th edition, then they had an increased attack, they had a ward save, they could not fight on mounts, they only could be on foot, and that was later changed in 7th and 8th edition where they can ride Terrorgeists and the such. But they couldn't use any magic items because basically these things were supposed to be so destructive in their own right. They've got Curse of the Revenant. So strong is the desire for some to continue living that they defy death. But this has a price, the eternal thirst for the blood of the living. And this basically just means the vampire has regeneration. Massive monstrosity, such as the size of some of the more ancient Strigoi, that a blow which would kill a normal creature is but a mere scratch to these gigantic beasts. They have an increase to their wound, meaning they have a more effective hit points, I guess you could say. Bat form, wrapping the power of darkness around him. Vampire metamorphosizes into a giant bat. Model has a fly special ability. Infinite hatred, the Strigoi know no love. Shunned by all, they brood in their solitude, vowing death upon all they meet. They can re-roll failed to hit wounds. Basically, you can look at that as melee attack if you're looking at it as a Total War Warhammer mechanic. Summon ghouls. The vampire bellows a guttural cry, which can be heard by his flesh-eating minions. These creatures are slaves to the authority of the Ghoul Kings. And of course, summons ghouls. Iron sinews. After death, the vampire's muscles grow far greater than they ever could have in his mortal life. The Strigoi becomes a beast of pure muscular power, increasing their strength by 1. So you can see that the Strigoi was meant to be this kind of creature that as soon as it gets into close combat, it does a huge amount of damage. It has an increase to its attack ability. It has hatred. It's meaning, and also it gives immune to psychology. I mean, there's so many things that meant that the Strigoi was there to just kind of fuck up someone's house. I mean, basically that's it. Like you have a different approach to combat that you had with the blood dragons, where blood dragons are more about finesse and how can I use my weapon skill and my superior attack abilities against you, versus the Strigoi, which are just about brutality and basically like gorilla pounding on your chest, more or less. And we saw that extended even in the Age of Sigmar. You see the Flesh Court, which is basically all the dead Bretonnians that died during the Great Plague of the End Times that come back and actually think that they're alive. And like there's a lot of perversions as a result of this. Not to say that the Flesh Court is directly connected to Strigoi, but distantly in the whole ghouldom situation. But there are 2 big Strigoi Ghoul Kings. And in fact, the very first true Ghoul King, the first one to actually hold the title, Ushoran, was never a true Ghoul King. He didn't kind of fall to the level of depravity that the Strigoi that we know today have. Vorag Bloodytooth was the first real Ghoul King, and he actually kind of got his start in Sylvania, in southern Sylvania, and he killed Franz von Karstein and drank his blood and kind of empowered him. And this is another cool little fact here, is that the Strigoi vampires are some of the only vampires to eat and kill and eat other vampires. Sure, vampires do kill each other, but it's kind of a taboo to drink another vampire's blood. The Strigoi have no qualms doing such things. They will drain anything at all. So this kind of helps Vorag become even more powerful and gains what is a significant court in the Ghoul Wood. Subsequently, though, he takes over portions of the Blackfire Pass, moving into the Border Princes, down into the Badlands, to try and hope and rekindle ancient Mourkain, kind of to recreate that lost empire. Eventually, he moves into the Plane of Bones in the Darklands, creating the Tower of Vorog. Unfortunately, there is where he meets his end when he is pierced through the heart by a goblin warband that attacks him. But you see that this kind of notion where the Strigoi try to come up and recreate Mourkain. It's always their goal, is to recreate Mourkain in the Strygos Empire. And recently, Gashnog is the Black Prince, as he is sometimes called, is actually a Strigoi vampire that rules a portion of the Border Princes. And through this, he actually uses a lot of guile and a lot of the kind of methods of the Lamians to manipulate and control humans, to actually not become a Strigoi that needs the adulation of other people. He doesn't need that kind of worship as a god. So he's able to kind of remove himself, which is part of the curse of his bloodline. And he's been able to kind of create this community that he's trying to turn into the next Strygos Empire. So you can see here that of all the bloodlines, the Strigoi bloodline is one of, if not the most tragic bloodline of all of them. And if we take a look at what we're going to be seeing in Total War Warhammer, we can see Strigoi, the Lord's Focus, the bestial juggernaut, vengeful monstrosities who dwell among cemetery graves. The broken-minded Strigoi embrace the primal force buried deep within us all. And they have minus 60% public order penalty due to presence or lack of corruption, ambush success chance, and vampiric corruption increase. So these guys are definitely going to be just those complete monsters on the battlefield. We'll kind of see how that kind of pans itself out. But hopefully you guys get a really good idea of how these guys are really kind of placing themselves in the lore. I wanted to do this Strigoi next because they're so directly linked to Neferata. And we'll talk about probably the Necroc vampires in our next video here, as we talk about Ushoran's big dealings with the Necroc vampires and how he kind of had a really heavy hand in manipulating things. Some of the more keen-eyed viewers were kind of quick to notice that Ark in the Black was the one that actually showed Neferata, the elixir of life. That has changed so much in the lore, and that's in the later parts, so I kind of just let that be. So if you notice some of these discrepancies, I would again point to the fact that the Vampire Bloodlines is probably some of the most liquid lore in the whole entire game. I mean, if you're going strictly on 8th edition lore, then these things don't even exist. There's no bloodlines, you know? So Blood Knights are blood dragons. Blood dragons don't exist in 8th edition. It's just blood knights. So you kind of have to take this with a grain of salt because there's so much peppering across the Warhammer RPGs, across the 6th, 7th, and 8th editions, across all the publications. So there's a lot going on here. So I'm trying to kind of condense things into the best possible format for you guys. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching here today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video on our Strigoi Vampire as we continue our march down the Bloodlines, culminating with the Lost Bloodlines, which there is unfortunately not a whole ton about, but I'll try to give you as much ceremony as I can. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to comment below, like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. But have a good one, and take care.